Today we're going to go over how to use the burn and dodge tools in both Photoshop and Photopea. But let's not forget everything that we've covered already this year. When you open a picture, remember the first thing that you want to do is make a non-destructive layer no matter what. So I'm going to drag my layer down to the new layer button. Make sure you're not just clicking and making a new layer. It's very important. Otherwise you get a blank layer. You want to make sure that you're actually dragging the layer all the way down to the new layer button so that you end up with a second copy of the same layer. You know it's the same layer because you can see the actual image displayed. If you ever don't like a layer that is there, you can drag and drop it down to the trash can. So same thing in Photopea here. If I take my layer, I can click and drag it down to my new layer button, then I have two. All right, going back to Photoshop here, we're going to start by doing our levels and curves. I'm going to just quickly go through that since we've done it. So going to my histogram, going to red, green, and blue separately, dragging into each edge of the mountain of the histogram, only selecting the one all the way to the left and all the way to the right. I'm not touching the gray one that's in the center. So if I look at my layers palette, I can see my adjustment by clicking the eyeball. It's very slight, but you do see a little bit more of that nice contrast in between the gecko and the tree. So let's go to Photopea and do the same thing. I'm going to go down and adjust the levels. Going to red, green, and blue separately, pulling in towards the base of the mountain. Really, this picture doesn't need too much at all. Okay, and again, I can hide the eyeball to see before and after. Liking my after, I'm going to hold Shift, click my top layer and my second layer, and then I can right-click to go to Merge Layers to put them together. So looking at my before and my after, I definitely like my after. So at this point, again, I can shift, select both layers, right click, and merge them together. So Photoshop, the same thing. I like my edit. I'm going to grab both and merge them together. And I also like my new edit versus my original that I had. So I'm gonna go hold Shift again and merge both of those together. Remember the shortcut for merge, if you're interested in using that, is going to be Control E or Command E if you're on a MacBook. All right, so I have to go to my curves now. So remember, we want to do non-destructive again, make a new layer in both of the programs. Okay, and this time I'll start in Photopea, going to my curves menu. We're forming the letter S here, so pulling up into the left, down into the right. You want to try to create that nice contrast without taking away any of the details. You don't want it to look fake. So before and after. Actually, I think I went a little bit too far with the shadows. I'm going to pull that out just a little bit. There we go. All right, so, and again, I know that I like all of these edits that I've done, so I'm going to grab all of my layers and Control E, or you can right click and go to Merge Layers. Let's do our curves on this one. Okay, and again, the letter S. I know that I'm going to pull my highlights just a little bit, but the shadows, I don't need to do too much. I'm just going to leave them where they're at. And I can merge these layers together again and make another non-destructive layer. I know it seems a little tedious to make these layers, but if you ever need to go back and look at your original, maybe you end up liking it better, or you want to go back to it instead of having to click backwards a bunch of times or go to your history palette and find out where it was. It's just nicer to have that approach to be able to go back to that original image, or at least the one that you liked. Okay. So let's go to our next step here, which is going to be the burn and dodge tool. You can find that right here, that it might be the dodge tool on top, the burn tool on top, or the sponge. I'm in Photoshop right now, looking at the difference in Photopea. Dodge tool, burn tool, sponge tool, almost exactly the same as far as what they look like in both of the programs. Okay, so going back to Photoshop here, the key is to make your subject pop without making it look unnatural. So right now the gecko really blends into the tree. There's not a lot of contrast with the colors in this picture. He's a little bit darker in value, so we can use that to our advantage thinking about where the light source is coming from, which is the top left of the scene coming down onto the gecko. And we can use that to add a little bit of shadow on that bottom side of the gecko here so that we can make him pop off of the texture of the tree that we have. So let's go ahead and go to the burn tool first. And I have my exposure right now set at 9%, so notice that at the top. I also have a nice soft brush. My hardness is at 0%. You don't want this to be a really harsh brush, and you don't want it to do too much at once, otherwise you're going to see a really extreme change. I also should mention that there's different things that you can adjust. When you're adjusting the shadows, as a beginner, I would definitely start with just doing the shadows. So make sure that your range is set to shadows. If you're adjusting the highlights, it's only going to adjust highlight colors in the photo or mid-tone photo or colors in the photo. So we want to make sure that it's always set to shadows. And I'm just going right where the light source is hitting it and going to the opposite side to create those nice strong shadows without it looking too overdone. Just little bits at a time. You have to have patience at this point as you go through. So let's look at my before and after. Okay, you can see it's starting to pop a little bit more off of that tree. Now let's go ahead and do the opposite and add in our highlights using the dodge tool. Dodge tool is the exact opposite, where I'm going to be adjusting the highlights. Now this one we can set to the midtones or highlights. I like to start with the midtones just to pull a little bit of those mid-range values up to the highlight just a little bit. Zoom into the eye. The eye is going to always give it a little bit of character, so we can go in and make that pop just a little bit more. It's going to help your image. So you're almost painting on your picture at this point. It's like a transparent paint. All right, so let's go ahead and see our before and after. Okay, we're already looking way, way better. And one final touch that you can do at this point is right above the burn and dodge tools is going to be a sharpen tool. Now I told you guys before that this tool doesn't actually sharpen the image, but it's going to take pixels from the surrounding area and crunch them together. So it almost appears to be clearer. So you can use it in moderation, just a little tiny bit, so you don't want to overdo this at all. My strength right now is at 50%. And my brush is at a 0% hardness still. So as I go over just the bottom edge here where I added my shadows, a little bit around the eye, again the shadow area, it's crisping it up just a little bit by pulling those pixels from the surrounding area so that it brings attention to that spot. And you can see that it really brings it off the tree. It adds a little bit of contrast right there. So there's my before and after with the gecko itself. All right, the picture already looks better. And now one final touch that you can do to make this more advanced is to add what we call vignette around the outside. So if I go to my layers palette, instead of this time making a non-destructive layer by dragging my layer down to the new layer button, this time I'm purposely going to add a blank layer. So I'm going to click the new layer button right now. And if I use my brush tool set to solid black, remember to look to make sure your numbers are all zeros so you can drag it to that bottom left-hand corner. And I want to make sure that I have a very, very fuzzy brush, so I'm going to turn my hardness all the way down to 0. And I'm going to turn my opacity down to about 50%. Okay, and at this point I am going to actually paint on my picture, just right around the outside. And it's going to look a little funky at first. It's almost like there's a spotlight on the gecko. Okay, and now this is where we can do something really cool. We can go up to Filter and down to Blur and over to Gaussian Blur. Gaussian Blur is just going to be a nice fuzzy overall blur. Make sure your preview mode is selected, and you can drag that down just a little bit so you can see how much you're actually blurring it. You want it blurred quite a bit so you can't see any of the paint job that you did around the outside. So now if I hide this layer, I can see my before and after. If you want to make this layer a little less harsh, you can go to your opacity on the layer and just turn it down a little bit. But having that nice vignette around the outside is going to bring your attention right to your subject. So now, if I just merge these top two layers, so hold shift, grab my top two layers, right click, and merge layers, I can see my original edit that I did, which it looked better with the levels and curves, and now with the vignette and with the crispness using the burn and dodge tools, a little bit of that sharpening just on that bottom edge, and it really makes a strong difference grabbing your attention and bringing it into the gecko. So one more time, let's go over to Photopea and do those steps. I'll do it a little bit quicker here. Okay, so we already did our levels and curves. I made that non-destructive layer. So let's go ahead and use our burn tool. You can adjust it to make sure it's on its shadows and that the hardness is all the way down. And let's turn our exposure down. I had it at 9%. Let's just put it at 10% here. And the key is to just hit where the shadows naturally would be. Think about your light source. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to lose any detail. You don't want it to look fake. So there are my shadows. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my highlights with my dodge tool. I'm going to set it on mid-tones. Again, make sure it's a nice fuzzy brush. Turn down my exposure. I'll do 10% again. And then go ahead in and start bringing out those highlights of where the light would be hitting it the strongest. Key is to go in, zoom in if it is something that's alive. Hit a little bit on the eyeball is always nice to make that pop. Okay, so there's my burn and dodge again, and my last step was to add that vignette around the outside, so I'm going to add a new layer using the new layer button. And now I can go ahead and grab my brush tool, same as Photoshop. Make sure it's on a nice fuzzy brush, so my hardness is still at 0. I'm choosing solid black, so make sure it's set to all zeros. Drag that all the way down to the corner. If it's not, click OK. And I'm going to change my opacity down to around 50% and start to go around those edges, building that kind of frame around the outside like I did before in Photoshop. Be careful that you are drawing on the correct layer at this point. If you draw on the picture layer, it's not going to be able to be blurred, or you will blur your picture. So you have to be on that separate layer, layer 1. And I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur once again. Make sure your preview is selected, and we can blur it as much as you'd like. Just want to make sure that you can't see any of those edges. It doesn't look fake. Okay, and then still, if it's a little bit too much, you can go to your opacity of your layer 1 and turn your opacity down so it's less harsh still. Just bringing your attention into the center there. And again, I'm going to hold shift and merge those two top layers together so that you can see the difference. So here is my now edited with the vignette, and here is my previous design where I just adjusted the levels and curves. Big difference, bringing your eye again to that center there and looking at our focal point, which is the gecko.